Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 25th of May of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. The most important and the most interesting updates are coming from Bakhmut. Today, as was promised, Prigozhin left Bakhmut. He had a lot of things to do. He had a lot of things to do during the day, and the first video he published was at 5 a.m. of the local time. And during that period of time, the Russians started the withdrawal process. They started the replacement process and so on. As you can see, Prigozhin was shaking a lot of hands with a lot of officers and so on. He was talking a lot and so on. And during the day, we got another interesting updates on the area between Ivanovska and Bakhmut. There was a video of that, and today was one of the biggest prisoners exchange process since the beginning of the special military operation. The Russians and the Ukrainians met each other on the road, on the local road between, let's say, Khromovo and Ivanovska, and there is a video of that. There was a video of that. As you can see, there were a lot of forces from both sides, and from the Russians and from the Ukrainians, and the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians returned around 106 soldiers. For now, we still haven't received any updates, any number, how many Russians were returned during that exchange process, but anyway, that was the biggest process since the beginning of that operation, and mainly that process was under control and coordination of Wagner. So that was Prigozhin last victory, let's say, in the vicinity of Bakhmut, and it is very strange why the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation still haven't provided any information about the number of forces, Russian forces, that were turned back to home. The Russians are saying that there were forces from LPR, from DPR, from Special Units Akhmat, and so on. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that as a result of artillery attacks, of probably of newly redeployed forces of Russian army, the Ukrainians took a decision to step back from Khromovo, and there were no updates about the fact that the Russians entered the settlement, but there were updates that Ukrainians left these positions. And it's very interesting because both two events about withdrawal of the Ukrainians from the north of Khromovo and the prisoners exchange process took place almost at the same time, and as you can see according to the map, almost at the same area. So to tell the truth, I don't think that the Russians were advancing in Khromovo because of exchange process, and that these two areas are located very close to each other. And furthermore, as you can see, if we take a look at this map, we see that the Russians did have fire control over the 0506 road from these brushes, from this forest line, and furthermore, I believe that the Russians did have established control over the fields and over the valley and over the 0506 road from the western part of Bakhmut. So I don't think that Ukrainians had possibilities to evacuate from this area without losses. So as I understand and as I see this entire situation, the Ukrainians and the Russians agreed on the territory to make the exchange process, and of course to do such kind of process when a lot of forces, a lot of prisoners of war from both sides were involved. I believe that there is only one way how to do this, is to make a small operational pause on this, and particularly on this part of the front line. So probably this situation, the Ukrainian forces who were blocked in Khromovo took a decision to use the situation, and meanwhile the entire operational pause, these forces left this bridgehead and currently are located in the safe zone. So let's wait a little bit more for Russian confirmations from this area. I believe that if the Russians enter this territory soon, they would provide us more updates, and we will be able finally update this map and to show this territory as the territory under Russian control. But for now, let's assume that this area is still in the gray zone or probably under the Ukrainian control. More interesting updates are coming from the south, from the area between Stupochki and Klishevka, from the channel area, let's call it like this. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of artillery attack, the Russians destroyed another ammo depot of AT's Air Assault Brigade. And if you remember, this AT's Air Assault Brigade, this is Stupochki, this is the area where their warehouse were located, and this AT's Air Assault Brigade was the main forces who were pushing the Russians on the northwest from Klishevka. So this is the AT's Air Assault Brigade. And if you remember, I'll remind you one more time that the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported about attacks against ammo depots of that brigade probably 2 or 3 times in a row since the beginning of that week or during the previous 10 days, something like this. So probably because of lack of ammo depot and heavy artillery fire and like airplane fire against this brigade, that brigade had some kind of lack of munition, so that's why they were forced to step back, and the Russians managed to advance and to establish control over this forest line that located on the south from the passage between the western and the eastern side of the channel. So let's update this map. So probably we assume that probably the Russians managed to achieve develop their bridgehead in this area as a result of operation with Russian forces and Russian artillery forces that destroyed the ammo depot of that 8th Air Assault Brigade. And that's it about the Bakhmut front line. There were no changes. One more time, Prigozhin left, and we will update this map as soon as we find out where exactly the Wagners were redeployed. We will move the icons of his forces exactly in that direction. But for now, that's it about Bakhmut. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the entire losses of the Ukrainians on the Donetsk front line was around 270 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. Now let's move to the second important area, and now we are going to talk about Kupiansk front line, where the Russians, probably the 3rd or the 4th day in a row, advances in the area of Liman Pervy and Masyutovka in this area. Today the Russians gave us more numbers from this bridgehead. For example, during the previous night, as a result of a small storm operation of Ukrainian checkpoints in the vicinity of this area, the Ukrainians lost 10 soldiers and 7 soldiers were captured by the Russians. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the entire losses of the Ukrainians on this front line were around 190 soldiers and 3 armored vehicles. So currently this is the second front line according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, based on the level of losses of the Ukrainians. So I assume that the Russians activated in this area, and probably the next days we're going to see more updates from the Russian side. So currently, based on the information we have, the Russians managed to capture the entire bridgehead on the eastern side of Oskol River. This is Oskol River that goes between Dvoriechno and Kupiansk. This like small snake. And probably, if you remember, a few days ago, or maybe a week ago, we got report that the Russians managed to cross Oskol River and to establish a small bridgehead on the western side of that river. And using that bridgehead, the Russians managed to secure the Russians' flanks, and currently they do have possibilities to advance further to the south in direction of Kupiansk. When talking about this area, I just have one question: whether the Russians are going or are planning to cross Oskol River to develop their bridgehead in the vicinity of this forest that located on the west of Oskol, and to cut the supply and support roads of Dvoriechno. So the question is whether the Russians are planning to launch the offensive operation against Dvoriechno. And the facts and the numbers and the Russians' advances are saying that they are planning to do this, and we are going to see this very soon. Now let's go a little bit to the south and let's talk about Liman front line. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fighting artillery duels, the Ukrainians lost 65 soldiers. So as you can see, the level of losses is almost the same level as was a month ago after the end of the active phase of storming operation of Bakhmut. Currently there are no changes. The Russians stopped right in the vicinity of Tarskoye, Yampulovka, Terny, Makeyevka, and they are not advancing further. There are very heavy clashes in the forest on the north of Bilogorovka, and today, for example, some Russian sources were saying that currently Bilogorovka appeared in a small operational encirclement. The Russians established the physical fire control over the roads that leads to the settlement, but for now we still don't see any withdrawal of Ukrainian positions, so probably they still have possibility somehow to support this area. But if the Russians were really successful, sooner or later we will got more updates about the Ukrainian position and Ukrainian poor situation on this bridgehead. Now let's go further to the south and let's talk about Avdiivka and Donetsk frontline, Donetsk tactical area. Today we received a lot of updates from this area, and the most important one are coming from Avdiivka and the area that located on the west from Pervomaiskaya. For example, today, if you remember, today and the previous night and the day before yesterday, the Ukrainians made few attempts to return control, or at least to push the Russians from Krasnogorovka bridgehead. Currently, the Russians control the entire railroad ways and the forest lines along those railroad ways, and these lines are located on the hills, so the Russians do have possibilities to control the entire situation on the south in the vicinity of Avdiivka, in Achertino, Novokalinovo, and so on. And the Ukrainians made a few attempts to push the Russians back from that bridgehead. And the result of one of those attacks were that and almost the entire squad of Ukrainian forces surrendered. They see the video the Russians published. As you can see, there is no danger for these soldiers. They took a decision to save their lives. Probably they will be moved to the mainland, and the Russians will start some kind of investigations. And if they don't have any problems, of course, they will be released or exchanged within the next exchange process that anyway will take place in the future. Furthermore, the Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of artillery attack, another ammo depot of 110th Brigade was destroyed in the vicinity of Avdiivka. So this is the situation about the Avdiivka tactical bridgehead, and now let's talk about Pervomaiskaya. If you remember, as you know, the Russians continue storming and advancing in direction of this interception of roads in the northwestern part of Pervomaiska. The Russians are pushing from Vadiana to the west along Pervomaiska. The Russians are trying to capture Nivoysk and so on. And as you can see, this is a very difficult operation, and as we can see based on the results, everything is not so good from the Russian side. But today we got a very interesting update that the Russians, as a result of artillery attack, as a result of bombings, destroyed the dam that Ukrainians were used as a bridge, as a road to supply and support their forces in Nitailova and Pervomaiska. So this bridge was destroyed, this one. And if you take a look at this map, you're gonna see that there are not many supply roads that Ukrainians were able and currently are able to use to supply and support their forces in Pervomaiska and Nitailova. So the Ukrainians used to use this supply road in the past, like yesterday and the day before yesterday, maybe today in the morning, but as a result of attack, the Ukrainians lost this possibility to use this area. Furthermore, the Ukrainians used to use this supply road for their forces that located in Nitailova, Pervomaiska, this one. But the thing is, and the problem is that currently, by attacking of this dam, the Russians destroyed the barrier, and currently this area is overflooded. So let's update this map and let's try to see the real pollution in this area. So probably this entire area is currently flooded with water, and as you can see, this water enters the territory of the second supply road from the south. So probably, as I understand, the Ukrainians don't have possibilities to use currently both these two roads. The first one because the dam was destroyed, and the second one because of flood pollution on the south of this dam and in the area of this supply road. And currently the weather is very bad in this area. It's very rainy, so I assume and probably the Ukrainians don't have possibilities to use, let's say, this supply road along the fields, along this valley in direction of Nitailova, and mainly because of bad weather and rainy weather, and furthermore the flood pollution and so on. And there is one way how the Ukrainians still able to supply their forces in Nitailova, and this road goes from Achertino, let's say, from Pokrovsk in direction of Nitailova through the north. So let's update this area using the green arrow. So possibly this is the only solution for the Ukrainians, how they can supply and support their force using this green area. But as we can see, this green area, this green road goes right exactly under Russian fire, under Russian control. So probably, and I believe that was the plan. Currently, I think that the Russians do have fire and visible control over this road. So we can say that currently the Ukrainian forces who are located in Nitailova and Pervomaiska appeared in small operational crisis. This is a small operational crisis that will take up to 3 or 4 days, at least until the water will go away from this area and the Ukrainians will restore the supply road. But before that, the Russians do have 3 or 4 days that they can use to storm these positions. So I assume and I expect that within the next 48 hours, the Russians will intensify their actions in the vicinity in direction of Nivolska and in direction of Первомайska with one purpose: to finally to penetrate this area and to capture these positions and to force the Ukrainians to step back maybe in the vicinity of Nitailova or even further in direction of Karlovka or even Yasnobrodovka. So I expect the activation of Russian forces because of destroy of this dam and the entire bad situation for the Ukrainians in this area. One more time, the Ministry of Defense reported that the total losses of the Ukrainians in this area was around 270 soldiers. So as usually, Donetsk front line is the first front line when talking about the losses. Now let's move to the south. Let's talk about South Donetsk and Zaporozhye area. As you can see, there are almost no changes, no big events. Of course, the Ministry of Defense report about artillery duels, clashes, but for now we don't have even some kind of photo video confirmations of that. And the losses of the Ukrainians in this area is the same level as it was yesterday, the day before yesterday. The loss is around 135 soldiers. One more time, when talking about the losses that we receive from the Ministry of Defense, we use these numbers just to understand the entire picture and the main front lines according to the Ministry of Defense classification, because we understand if the losses are high, that means that this front line is very important for the Ministry of Defense because they are completely concentrated in this area and they're trying to show or make some progress in this or that area. Now let's move further, and we're to Kherson area. Today the Russians published more video about the usage of guided bombs. They attacked the Berislav ammo depots, Ukrainian positions. You can see the explosions are very heavy, and all those explosions were achieved by the usage of the guided bombs. As you can see, this is a very terrible and very powerful weapon that the Russians have possibility to use, and this is the reason of the loss of the numbers of loss of the Ukrainians on this front line. Now let's move to the Black Sea and to Crimea. First to Crimea. During the previous night, the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack Crimea using drones and from Odessa. And as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to destroy 2 drones in the sky, and few of them were captured by the Russians, like technologies, radio signals, and were captured by the Russians and were put down on the surface, on the ground. Very interesting updates are coming from the Black Sea. The Ukrainians published their version of attack against the Russian ship. If you remember, yesterday we discussed that situation, and the Ministry of Defense reported that 3 of those ships were destroyed, that attack were repulsed. But today the Ukrainians published their own video, and based on that video we understand that yes, maybe 3 of those drones were destroyed, but 2 of them probably were destroyed under the Russian fire, and one of the drones managed to hit the Russian ship and to damage it. Yes, as you can see, there is some kind of differences in versions. So as you can see, the signal of that drone disappeared right exactly before the moment of the touching of the surface of the ship. So probably the Ukrainians did damage the ship, and for now we don't have any video or photo confirmations about the level of those damage. But anyway, the situation is very critical, because when talking about the Ukrainians, I believe that they can afford themselves endless number of navy drones, and the Russians can't afford themselves endless number of ships, and they need to try to save and to keep as much as possible, and they can't afford themselves to lose more ships of the Black Sea Fleet or something like this. And that's it for this video, for this update. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.